Surely, at this point, you've seen Imperial Yeast's amazing selection of high-quality brewing yeasts over at imperialyeast.com. But you might not be as familiar with Imperial Yeast's special order yeast bank. In addition to their tried-and-true core strain selection, Imperial Yeast has a number of ale or lager strains, Brettanomyces, Kveik, and other yeasts available for special order. If you're looking to match a yeast strain currently in production, or just looking for something new to play with in the brew house, reach out to Imperial Yeast customer service to see what they may have in store. Special order strains are subject to a 10-liter order minimum and require a 2 to 3 week propagation time, but they might just be what you're looking for your next brew. You can get more information about Imperial Yeast's special order strains by calling 503-477-5826 or emailing customerservice@imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. Hops are one of the main ingredients in beer, and certainly one of the ingredients that brewers take the most time thinking about when designing recipes. But for some brewers, like with other raw ingredients, there's often not very much thought about what happens behind the scenes before the hops get to the brewery. I'm your host, Cade Job, and today in the lab I'm speaking with Dr. Lindsey Rubottom, currently with Hop Valley Brewing Company in Eugene, Oregon, and formerly of Dr. Tom Shellhammer's lab here at OSU, where she conducted this research. Hops are a unique crop in that the farmer not only grows the hops, but also processes them by picking off all the hop cones and then drying them at the farm in a kiln before baling them and shipping them off to a distributor. If that sounds like a lot, it is. Hops are dried for a variety of reasons, but this aspect of the process, the temperature at which hops are dried in the process, could play a big role in hop quality, especially for aroma hops, which might see their valuable aromatic properties blow off if the hops are kilned at too high of a temperature. Or at least that was the thought. And so when Lindsey decided to look into this, she found a much less clear picture than, quote, the common wisdom might suggest, which led to some interesting findings that could change aspects of how hop growers dry hops. Namely, by increasing the drying temperature, it may not have as big of an impact on those aroma hops as originally thought. But of course, that is the subject of Lindsey's research. So this is a hop processing episode. We're going to talk about the research that Lindsey did, looking at the different drying temperatures at which hops might be dry and the impact on hop quality. So we'll talk about that research and also what this means for you. But first, I wanted to say another big thank you to our patrons. If you're not currently a patron, I encourage you to head to patreon.com/brewlosophy and check out the monthly contribution levels. In addition to those feel-good vibes of helping to support the work we do here at Brewlosophy, you get access to a bunch of awesome rewards depending on the different pledge levels that you choose. You get access to Brewlosophy contributor recipes that we've never published, new discounts each month to YakimaValleyHops.com, and for $3 a month, access to a monthly live Q&A session with a special guest from the brewing industry. This month's guest is homebrewing legend Marshall Schott. That's right, Mr. Brewlosopher himself will be answering questions from patrons this month, and he's not afraid to answer whatever you want to ask, so give him some hard ones. Head over to patreon.com/brewlosophy to find all the information you need to attend this session. Thank you to everyone who's left a rating or review of the show. If you haven't yet left a rating or review, I'd love for you to do so. I love hearing from y'all. It's a great source of feedback, and it helps others like you find the show. Without those reviews, we wouldn't have the Applying the Science series with Jordan, and the show wouldn't be what it is today. So thank you to all those who have left a review, and if you haven't yet, please take a moment to help us out. I'd really appreciate it. Feedback is brought to you by the folks from John I. Haas, who over the last couple years have released a handful of really cool hop products like Lupamax, Incognito, and Flex, all intended to improve beer while reducing vegetal matter and thus increasing yields. Well, they're excited to announce another 100% hop-derived product, especially made for your patio, lawnmower, or beach beers. Kettle Ready imparts smooth, light, stable bitterness and kettle hop aroma to beer while offering microbiological protection during the brewing process. This new product is easy to use, has no special dosing requirements, plus due to its standardized high alpha acid concentration in a light, stable molecule, it gives the light stability and bitterness characteristics desired for all traditional beers. And it plays well with other Haas products, including Tetra Hop Gold, Hexa Hop Gold, and Ready Hop, for flexibility and optionality when brewing light, stable beers. Learn more about Kettle Ready at johnihaas.com. That's John, the letter I, Haas.com. All right, listener Dave wrote in with a show suggestion. He says, Cade, hope all is well at Brewlosophy. Huge fan of the show. The more I venture down the road of brewing, which is on a homebrew level, I continuously find new rabbit holes to venture down to improve my recipes or process. It seems easy to find information on mash pH, target ranges for mash pH, and the effects pH has on alpha and beta amylase in the mash. However, I'd like to suggest an episode on post-boil target pH for various beer styles and how to predict the level of drop in pH you'll encounter during fermentation. I've recently started taking post-boil and post-fermentation pH ratings, and I'm blown away at how differently the few yeast strains I've monitored drop in pH. It leaves me wondering if I should be making post-boil adjustments for fruit-forward IPAs to express a slight tartness, which seems fitting for the style for a fruit-forward beer by lowering the pH pre-fermentation. My next suggestion is in applying the science episode for the show requested above, since, of course, you and Jordan will probably have lots to say about it. Thanks for all the research. All right. Well, thanks, Dave. This is a great show idea. I just need to find someone with experience or research that could talk about it. I certainly agree that post-boil pH adjustments and pH drop during fermentation, I think might play a bigger role than people give it credit for. I mean, we talked on the last Applying the Science episode, though, that Jordan's done a couple experiments where he's looked at post-boil pH, one of which was significant in an American IPA, but the other one was not significant in a lager. And so your comment there about the yeast is also an interesting aspect. I don't know if anyone's done a study looking at how pH drops during fermentation. I mean, I'm sure there have been studies showing that pH drops during fermentation. I just mean, I don't know if there's a way to predict it. And it may be different based on yeast, but I'll certainly check and see what we can come up with. And thank you again for the show idea and for listening to the show. I'm going to take a quick break and I'll be back in a few minutes with Dr. Lindsey Rubottom talking about how kiln drying temperature impacts hop quality. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com.
Shopify helps you sell at every stage of your business. Like that, let's put it online and see what happens stage.
And the site is live.
That we opened a store and need a fast checkout stage.
Thanks. You're all set.
That count it up and ship it around the globe stage.
This one's going to Thailand.
And that, wait, did we just hit 1 million orders stage? Whatever your stage, businesses that grow with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 a month trial at shopify.com/listen.
When hops arrive at your brewery, they're not coming straight from the farm. Most breweries operate a long way away from the hop farm, and it's expensive to distribute a whole bunch of leafy, wet material that's going to start decomposing as soon as it's cut off the vine. So for preservation and storage, hops are dried on farm. It's this practice of drying the hops on farm, so-called kilning, that we're talking about today with my friend and former colleague, Dr. Lindsey Rubottom. Lindsey, welcome to the Brew Lab.
Hey. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm glad for you to be here. I'm so excited to finally have you on the show. I mean, you've been studying this topic for 5 years now, and have, of course, several publications. You've given several presentations on hop kilning, and it's actually the subject of your recent PhD dissertation. So congratulations, by the way, Dr. Lindsey Rubottom. Are you tired of talking about kilning yet?
No. Still pretty interesting. It's a multifaceted issue. You could spend a lifetime studying it.
Yeah, well, that's good. I'm glad then, because we're going to do it again. But yeah, like I said, this was, of course, one of the subject of your PhD dissertation. You did a whole bunch of research on it, and had a huge impact on the industry and how the industry dries hops. But I want to introduce you first before we get into talking about your research, and specifically the paper we're going to talk about today is the research that you did looking at 2 different drying temperatures, drying at 130 Fahrenheit and 150 Fahrenheit, and then figuring out what that did to the hops. But before we get there, so you now have a job in industry. So you're the head of quality assurance at Hop Valley Brewing Company in Eugene, Oregon. And so I want to know, how did you become interested in studying brewing science?
Well, my pathway to brewing science started as an undergraduate degree in chemistry. I was studying chemistry at Chico State, thought I wanted to be a synthetic organic chemist, went and did a few internships in organic chemistry and decided I did not want to be a synthetic organic chemist. Life in a fume hood was not for me. And Sierra Nevada was hiring a R&D intern at the time when I was coming back from an internship in Nebraska. And I thought, well, why not try out analytical chemistry? Not thinking too much about the brewing component, thinking more about the chemistry and the instrumental analysis component. And then it was there that I just totally fell in love with beer and brewing science and how it's so intertwined in like engineering, biology, microbiology, chemistry. You never know who you're going to be or what you're going to have to do when you come in solving these different problems in the brewing industry. So it keeps it entertaining and to say the least, and interesting from a day-to-day perspective.
Yeah, well, how cool too. Like starting off at Sierra Nevada, I can certainly see where your interest in brewing came from. And I think you were working with Tom Nilsson and Maria Mutsoglu there, right?
Yes, I was.
Yeah, both former guests on the show. So how did you get roped into studying kilning and hop kilning?
So I joined, when I applied to graduate school, kind of backpedaling a little bit, I knew I wanted to be studying brewing science, and I wanted to be working with beer and beer quality and systems that we could look at raw materials and how we can make beer better. So that turned into a opportunity to join Tom Schellhammer's lab at Oregon State University. And from there, this project was kind of just getting off the ground, and it was a project that the lab at OSU had multiple years of funding, and I started as a master's student and the goal of getting my PhD, so I was going to be there a while. So I inherited this hop drying project, which at first I was like, hop drying? It was something that I had never even considered, and now I'm very intimate with the nature of hop drying and the nuances that go along with it. But it was a study that was kind of handed off to me from my predecessor, Scott LaFontaine from Tom's lab, who kind of did the preliminary work to kind of see if there was anything here in this space.
Yeah, it's amazing how that stuff works too. It's such a great group to be a part of, and that's of course how you and I met. Whenever I started in Tom's lab, and you handed off some projects to me, the hop maturity stuff that I've been working on recently with Tom, which is really cool. And so this whole kilning project. I mean, again, you spent 5 years doing this research, and there's no way we're not going to be able to talk about all 5 years of that. I think you have something like, is it 5 publications from this research?
Something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Anyway, so we're not going to be able to talk about all of that, but the study that we're talking about today is one that I think is really interesting because it's kind of I don't want to call it like a culmination of the research of the 5 years, but it was a really nice and tight like look at how temperature affects drying, right? And so the whole point of this study was to look at a high temperature and a low temperature and see, or really like kind of maybe even a normal temperature, right? 130 Fahrenheit is kind of a normal drying temperature, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so it's kind of like looking at a normal drying temperature, which I'm going to call a low temperature for reasons we'll get to in the future. But a low and a high, look at how it impacts hop chemistry, look at how it impacts sensory, look at how it impacts hop creep, so hop dextrin-reducing enzyme activity. And you looked at 6 different varieties: Amarillo, Cascade, Centennial, Citra, Mosaic, and Simcoe. I think that's the list of the top 5 or top 6 hop varieties in the U.S.
That was definitely built by design. We actually surveyed brewers who are a part of the Hop Research Council to find out which varieties they felt was most important to have in this study.
Yeah.
And surprise, surprise, the top 5 hop varieties are some of the most used and commonplace hop varieties were the ones that they had selected.
Yeah. Of course. And, again, this is something that we don't normally think about as brewers, is this kilning step, right? This drying step. Commercial brewers that are doing hop selection are going out into the field and they're smelling hops that have been dried, or, they might actually be smelling wet hops too from out in the field. They're smelling through these hops and then it comes to you as the brewer. Homebrewers are even further down the chain, right? Most homebrewers are using pellets, which have been dried in the kiln and then pelletized and then delivered to the brewer. So there's this whole step, this whole like change from the wet cone that's on the vine to this dry whole cone or pellet that we use as brewers. And it turns out that there could be some things that are of interest there. Like, for example, do oils blow off during the during kilning? What happens to enzyme activity? Do we see bitter acid changes? Do the hops change in terms of sensory component? So it makes a lot of sense to look at this as like really what's happening to the hop in this situation. So we're going to start by talking generally about kilning. We'll talk about some of the background studies that you did, and then we'll jump into the results of this study. So what actually happened to hops that were dried at 2 different temperatures? So this is the first show I've done really about hop processing. I mean, I've had Jeff Daly on the show talking about incognito and some of the hop extracts. But this is the first show that I've done about like how hops get from the field to the brewery. So let's start kind of with the general overview of the process. How do hops make it from the field to the brewery?
So, I mean, first you're going to start out at your hop farm. You've got these beautiful, wonderful aromatic vines growing in the field. And when it comes time, when they reach their optimal harvest maturity, which is like a whole other topic I'm sure Cade will dive into at some point with some other scientists.
I gotta get somebody to interview me.
So once they reach their optimal harvest maturity, so when that aroma is just right, they are then set to be picked. So they go through the hop picking process, which separates the cones from the hop vines. And from the hop vine or from the cones, they go to the kiln. And these kilns are typically 32 by 32 feet. And generally, depending on what farm you're at, they typically dry between 24 and 30 inches in bed depth. So that's like American style hop drying. That's what's primarily happening in the Pacific Northwest and what I primarily looked at as far as drying method. And during that time, hot air is blown from a plenum through the hotbed to blow off all of the moisture. And they use, pretty variable temperatures. I mean, I'm sure we'll get into some questions on the historics of hop drying, but then once they're dried and they reach this optimal kind of this 8 to 12% moisture content, hops are then dumped into a baling room where they're left to cool. And that cooling step is really important because that's kind of like an equalizing step of the moisture content in the hops. So you have the bed depths or in the kilns that are 30 inches. So you're going to get some gradation in the moisture content in the hotbed. So those bottom of the bed is going to be a little over dried. The middle of the bed is going to be probably just right in that like 8 to 9 or 10% range. And then the top of your bed might be a little under dried in the 15% range. So then this cooling step becomes really important because as the hops sit on the cooling room floor, they kind of equilibrate the moisture content so that we get hops that are roughly in that 8 to 12% moisture content, which then are pressed into bales and sent to your hop brokers to either pelletize, sell as whole cones, or be turned into other hop products.
Yeah, like extracts or any of the other products like, Incognito Spectrum, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, mostly going into pellets, though, I guess, except for the brewers like Sierra Nevada, for example, that's still using whole cones in some of their brands. Interesting. Okay, so the it starts in the field, and then it runs through a picker where the cones get picked off, and then it goes into a kiln. And like you said, these kilns are huge. They're 32 feet by 32 feet and like 30 inches deep. So like almost, 32 to 34 inches deep, almost 3 feet deep. That's a ton of hops. And if you've never seen a picture of this, I encourage anybody to go online and look at a picture of a hop kiln. It's really, really impressive. But so one of the questions then I guess I have is like, why then, what's the goal of hop drying? Why don't we just pick the cones off of the vine and then ship them immediately to the broker for processing? Why do we go through this drying process?
Well, when you have like that high moisture content in your hop products or your hops, they're going to rapidly degrade. You're going to lose aroma. You're going to get browning. You're going to get oxidation. When they're wet, they're going to rapidly degrade. So this drying step is really a preservation step. It's preserving all of those wonderful, fruity, juicy, citrusy, tropical aromas that we love so much about American aroma hops, so that they can be used in these beers or in beers down the line. So you don't have to use them right away. I mean, with like fresh hop beers, for example, when those fresh hops come off the vine and go to the brewery, they have to be used in a really narrow window of time. Like you have maybe, if you're lucky, 24 hours to get those from field to beer.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a good point, right? I mean, it makes sense. Because here I was thinking about this just from like a shipping perspective, right? If you're going to ship from Yakima to, say, Florida, right, where there's a brewery, I mean, that's going to take a long time. And those hops are going to sit in a hot container. And like you said, that rapid degradation, that's a big deal. But I didn't realize it was even that fast, like 24 hours. That's huge. But so then the kilning step, again, is to get it down to like the right moisture content. And you mentioned this sort of like 8 to 12% window. Like what happens if hops are like over dried or under dried? Is that a problem, or is it just kind of like, part of the process?
So when they're under dried, you're going to run into that they are higher in moisture content. So there is going to be some level of degradation. So if you have like 25% moisture content hops that are severely under dried, they are going to degrade. And that moisture content can actually cause spontaneous combustion in hop bales, which turns into a whole safety hazard all on its own right there. You have this oil-rich, like resinous hops that have created a heat hotspot in the bale that then ignites. Then you've got a pretty big fire hazard on your hands if you're a farmer or a hop broker. So that moisture content becomes really important. And then if they're over-dried, they run into they're just like visually don't look as good. And nobody wants to buy hops that don't look great, even though they could smell wonderful. And then they are also way more prone to shatter. So the cones, when you grab them, they just absolutely disintegrate into dust. And then they become really difficult to process.
Yeah. It makes sense, right? Like you can't form a pellet with it because it's like too fine. You basically make just like hop sand if they're over dried.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. I see. So then this drying process is important, right? From a very practical standpoint, we've got to get hops from point A to point B, from farm to broker to brewery. And we also have to be able to process them. We want to turn them into pellets for storage and saving space. And we also need to make, CO2 extracts and stuff like that with it. So this whole process of drying seems very important. How long does it take to dry hops whenever they come from the field?
So, I mean, it really becomes variety dependent. So each different hop variety has different cone morphology. They can be like longer and packed really tightly, like with the leaves of it, or they can be like pretty loosely packed and small cone. So that can have a really big impact on how those hops are going to lay in the bed and how dense the bed is going to pack, which is going to really change how quickly or not so quickly hops dry. So you get a variety like Centennial, which is a variety that takes a really long time to dry, can take upwards, depending on what temperature you're using, of course, can take upwards of 12 to 14 hours to dry. So from a capacity perspective, that sucks.
Yeah.
Like you have a kiln that is pretty much occupied for 14 hours because you have to think of the loading time, the drying time, the cooling time, and the emptying time. So if you have a variety like Mosaic, which can dry in 7 hours at the same temperature. So you have like these different variables to look at, but then you run into other issues where like Mosaic is a really high yielding hop. So even though it dries shorter, it's really hard to keep up with the demand in the kiln to make sure you're picking at optimal harvest maturity.
Interesting. So if you've got this varietal difference, then if you've got Centennial that's taking 12 to 14 hours to dry, that must be a real problem for the growers to deal with, right? Like this kilning step seems like it might really be difficult for the growers to manage.
It absolutely is. I mean, it can be a real bottleneck. I mean, if you have all of your kilns full drying hops, you're stopping picking production. Like you're not having hops being picked in the field. You're pretty much at a standstill until you can get kilns cleared.
I see. So you actually, so this is a huge problem for them then. They're not able to, they have to stop picking. So, and well, I guess also too, I guess we should make a statement here. The hop picking window is really short. It's only about 5 weeks or 6 weeks and maybe even that might be a little longer for some fields. So all of the hops are being picked in this very, very, very narrow window. So hop farmers are running at 24 hours a day, 7 days a week during that whole period, right?
Yes. That's what makes hop like such an interesting like crop to be working with when you're evaluating quality, because with malt, like barley, it's like barley isn't dried or malted where it's grown. It goes somewhere else to be taken care of. And hops are typically dried on the farm they are grown at.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because like I've seen like corn and wheat and all that stuff. I mean, those crops are processed off of the farm, right? They're harvested on the farm and then they get transported somewhere else to process. And so that's one of those reasons why I was asking that question earlier about hops. Like, why are hops actually processed on the farm? But it sounds like if they're not kilned on the farm, then there is a very, very low shelf stability of hops. And based on what you're telling me, different cone morphologies and varietal differences, you really can't risk, sending wet hops away to a supplier because of that spontaneous combustion thing, the degradation. So you really have to maintain this. Wow. So it's okay. I'm starting to see now why this kilning research was super important for you to do and for Tom to look at, because it's a big, big bottleneck for American hop farmers. So you mentioned temperature as temperature could play a role in how long it takes for a variety to dry. So talk to me about what temperatures growers are drying at.
So, I mean, do you want me to get into the history of why we landed where we are, or kind of start from the beginning, or where we are today?
Let's go. Let's start with where we are today and then how we got where we are.
Perfect. Today we are typically drying aroma varieties anywhere from 125 to 135 is pretty standard practice at this point in time. And that's across aroma varieties. So if you have varieties that are mostly just for alpha purposes, they tend to bump the temperature a little bit higher, maybe that 135 to 140, because they're not worried about the aroma characteristics. So when you're kind of thinking about these lower temperatures, the thought was that if you use these lower temperatures, you were going to preserve those aroma volatiles that are in hop oil that kind of create these wonderful aromas that we get in our hoppy beers. And they thought higher temperatures, you would more likely see a flash off of those volatiles. So it was a well-intentioned change to lower temperatures, where historically, when we were only concerned about like alpha and bitterness, hops were dried anywhere from like 140 up to 155.
Yeah, and
much higher temperatures than where we are today.
Yeah, 140 to 155. I mean, that's much higher. I mean, you're talking about 125 to 135. Well, I mean, it's only 10 degrees, I guess, but that could play a huge role in time. Like, what's the time difference if you're drying, say, in this like 130 range versus like up at 150? What's the time difference for growers?
I mean, you generally get a time difference of, again, hop variety dependent. You could get anywhere between like a 20 to 45% reduction in your drying time, drying between those two different temperatures. Like you could get anywhere like a mosaic, for example, drying at 7 hours at 130, drying in 5.5.
Oh my gosh.
At 150, which could provide a really big time savings for the grower and kind of alleviate a little bit of that bottleneck if hop quality is not impacted.
Yeah, if hop quality, that's a key right there. Whoa, like that's a big, big key, right? If hop quality is not impacted. So it sounds like growers were originally up at higher temperatures, like in this 150 range or higher. And that's because you mentioned this because hops were mostly grown for their acid capacity, right? Their alpha acid capacity. So then, and I guess was there some study that looked at like to see if alpha acids were sensitive to temperature?
Yeah, there's a lot of historic studies looking at that, ranging from the 30s all the way into the 80s, like kind of confirming that hop drying temperature does not influence alpha acids. So that was kind of an area that was like, okay, well, it doesn't matter. It's not hurting what we care about in hops, so we can dry them at a higher temperature and not worry or have any kind of issues with quality from that perspective.
Right. And then, of course, we changed what we wanted out of hops, right? We switched from alpha acids to all this aroma when we start adding dry hops and Whirlpool and all that. And then so then who decided to start moving the kilns down lower? Was there like some study that came out that was like, yeah, hop aroma volatiles are burning off at these higher temperatures and we need to reduce kilns? Or was this just kind of like, hey, maybe we should start dropping this?
It's kind of a culmination of things, really. It's that the industry was concerned about this and thought, like, like I said, a well-intentioned drift to lower temperatures to try in an attempt to preserve quality. And then there was a study in 2013 that from the Hop Quality Group that looked at Citra and Cascade, if I'm remembering correctly, and tried to look at airflow, bed depth, temperature, a whole gamut of things that could influence hop quality from the drying perspective, and tried to then look at the chemical components of that, and found that maybe that there was the potential that higher temperatures could influence hop quality. The thing is with that study is that they didn't look at the sensory components. They just looked at the analytical side of it. But that was enough to kind of, the industry was like, oh, we really care about aroma hops. We really care about aroma volatiles. And this kind of is lending that maybe we should dry at lower temperatures. So that just kind of drove this shift to lower temperatures.
Yeah, and right, to preserve aroma volatiles. And I mean, if you've ever been in a hop kiln, you can smell. I mean, it smells like it smells great. It smells like really a nice hop, like hops. It smells like fruity. It smells tropical. It sometimes smells a little onion and garlicky. But it smells really great. And so you walk into a hop kiln and you got to be thinking like, wow, there's all this aroma that's just being lost and driven off. I mean, that makes total sense to me. That you might be losing aroma during this whole drying process. But then I think you mentioned earlier a study that Scott was sort of looking at, and this kind of parlayed into one of the first studies that you looked at, or that you wrote on. And that was the study back from 2021 where you looked at a range of temperatures, like drying hops from 120 to 180 Fahrenheit, which actually for the international folks, 49 to 71 Celsius is what we're looking at, sort of in that range, 49 to 71 Celsius. So what I want to focus a little bit on this study because I think it guides where you went with the 130, 150 and helps us understand those results a little bit better. So talk to us real quick about that study, 120 to 180, and some of the takeaways.
Yeah, so that study, we looked at two hop varieties. We looked at Simcoe and Amarillo. And the goal of this was to really blow out the range of temperatures. We wanted to look at such a low temperature that there's no way anyone would ever dry at that temperature because it would be absolutely inefficient to dry hops at 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Like, it would just take way too long. You would never get through all of your acreage that you would need to be picking. But then we wanted to look at the other end of the spectrum. It's like, okay, what's the highest temperature we could get to? And not that we would ever recommend anybody dry hops at 180 degrees Fahrenheit. It was more just to make an example out of it, to create like these data points where we dried at 120, 140, 160, and 180 to see like, okay, what would it look like between a wide range of temperatures and drying? And let's like really blow that out into temperature ranges that no one would ever use. And in that, the first year we did that study, it was kind of dumbfounding. We expected to see these differences, especially with a wide temperature range. And we weren't seeing chemical differences. We weren't seeing differences in our terpene profiles. We weren't seeing differences in total oil. We weren't seeing differences in sensory from hop grinds and from single hop IPA brewing. We weren't seeing it. So we thought like, this is weird. Did we do something wrong? Like, it seems pretty intuitive, right? Or like, yeah, there should be a difference. We're here just kind of exploratory. We're putting some numbers on something that the industry's already doing and believes. Not thinking that we were going to go into this and find that maybe temperature didn't matter. And then, so we went ahead and repeated this study another year. Same varieties, went back to the same hop farm, same commercial kilns, and found the same thing. There was only one component of this that we found where temperature had a impact from like the analytics, is there was a significant decrease in hop dextrin reducing enzymes with respect to drying at higher temperatures, which totally makes sense. That's pretty intuitive. Like, higher temperatures, you're going to denature more enzymes. And then in turn, you're going to see less of a hop creep issue.
Mm-hmm. So interesting. So you don't see any changes in alpha acids or terpene profiles or analytes, or at least not anything definitive. And also in sensory, actually, people smelling these hops and you brewed beers with these hops as well, right?
Yep.
Yeah. And
sure
so,
did.
Yeah. I know this. I know you brewed a bunch of beers, a lot of beers. But there was no impact on hop sensory there. So we don't see significant chemistry differences. We don't see hop sensory differences, but you do see a difference in hop creep potential. The higher that you kiln, the lower the hop creep, right? And the enzymes are denaturing. That's what we've talked about on the enzyme show with Shopi Halamane. That at certain temperatures, enzymes start to denature, and it sounds like getting up into these higher temperature ranges, you're definitely controlling hop creep. I mean, that sounds like pause there for a second, and I go like, holy moly, that sounds really beneficial for everybody, right? It sounds beneficial for the grower because the grower can cut down on drying time. It sounds like it's beneficial for the brewers because it doesn't change or has minimal impact on sensory and chemistry, and you're reducing hop creep, which is a big problem for a lot of breweries, right? So it seems like, holy moly, like there's all these positives that let's just kiln at 180. Right? But
I wouldn't say 180.
Yeah, right. Not 180. And I guess, well, let me ask you that question then. So why not 180? Why maybe something like 150, which is what you did in this study?
Well, because when you're really trying to think of like an efficiency standpoint, like you have to kind of consider the energy inputs and then like just the safety of running multiple kilns at 180 degrees Fahrenheit with a bunch of hops that have this resinous characteristics. You really don't want to be putting your whole operation at a risk of a fire.
Yeah.
I mean, it was interesting working with these growers. A lot of them were hesitant to even go up to 160, just in, concerns of fire safety.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, right? We don't want to set anything on fire, and we want to make sure that the hops are growing right. And of course, that's a good point too about the energy, right? It takes a lot more energy to hold hops at a higher temperature, especially that volume of hops to get them up to that temperature and hold it there. Okay. So then let's talk about your study design. So again, I've mentioned it a couple of times now. You compared two temperatures. So there was a low temperature. I'm calling that low because it's the lowest one in this study, but it was at 130 Fahrenheit, which is, like we've talked about, very normal. That's 54 Celsius, a very normal hop drying temperature. And you compared that against 150 Fahrenheit or 65 Celsius. How'd you select 150?
So what it really came down to is when we were looking at that 120, 140, 160, we're like, okay, this is a very large range. And as you get to the lower and upper end, these aren't temperatures that are practical. So the thought was to be like, how about we bring the range into very like practical temperatures? Like, so 130 was selected because, we get a range of 125 to 135 is what's being used commercially in the industry. So we kind of landed in the middle there to be like, okay, this is kind of representative of what's happening now. And then the thought was to do 150 to be like, okay, what if we bump that up 20 degrees and see like from a high temperature perspective, that would be a realistic, usable high temperature. Like, what would happen? And typically, a lot of growers are using a technology called MeasureTech, and they have these systems in place where they are using a higher temperature up front in order to bring the hop bed to temp. So they'll use a temperature like 150 or 155 in the very early stages of drying until the middle of the hotbed gets to their set point. Let's say it's 130. And then they'll turn the kiln down to that 130 set point for the remainder of drying. And that's pretty common practice, especially with the growers that have the MeasureTech systems that monitor that.
I see. So a lot of growers are starting off at higher temperatures anyway, just to get the bed up to the right temperature. And then you want to hold it for the most of the time at that 130 Fahrenheit-ish temperature, right? And okay, and so that makes sense too. One thing you also mentioned earlier was historically, right? Hops were historically dried in that 145 to 155. That's kind of where they were before the creep down for aroma varieties. So that's great. It sounds like you've got like two very good temperatures here: 130 Fahrenheit, 54 54 Celsius, and 150 Fahrenheit, 65 Celsius. And then, of course, the power of this study is just incredible too. So 6 American hop varieties, again, Amarillo, Cascade, Centennial, Citra, Mosaic, Simcoe, 2 harvest years. So you did it in 2020 and 2021, and you did it in 2 states, Washington and Oregon. There's a note about the Centennial that we'll get to whenever we do the results. One of the growers pulled out of their Centennial field between the 2020 and 2021 harvest, which we'll get to in a minute because those results are still interesting for reasons that we'll talk to in a minute. But this is pretty incredible. 6 different varieties, 2 different harvest years, 2 different states, 2 different temperatures, and full commercial scale kilns. So one question I have to ask before we get to the break is, I can't believe the growers actually let you muck around with, how many pounds of hops are in a kiln?
A lot.
A lot. I mean, there's got to be like, I don't know.
A lot.
Several thousand pounds in a kiln.
Yes, several thousand pounds.
Right. That's pretty cool confidence that they allowed you to do this study and muck around with that. Apparently, we'll find out what they did with the hops and if it works. So let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to look at how kilning at those high and low temperatures impacted hop quality. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
Established in 1995, More Beer has been consistently serving the greater brewing community since the times IPA was expected to be bitter and clear, and there are reasons they've stuck around so long. In addition to their massive product selection and excellent customer service, More Beer has locations on both the west and the east coast of the United States, which translates into fast shipping times regardless of where you live. And when you spend more than $59, shipping is free. When you're in need of brewing ingredients and gear, there's no better option than morebeer.com, one of the most trusted shops on the planet.
Hops are an important ingredient in beer, providing balancing bitterness and hop aroma to offset malt and yeast character. For years, hops were kilned at higher temperatures because bitterness wasn't impacted, and hops were valued for their alpha acid capacity. With the rise of aroma hops and their use in beer, the kilning temperature started to creep lower. Makes sense, right? Drop the temperatures and preserve aroma. Easy peasy, Lindsay, and done deal. We don't need to research this, right?
If only it were that simple.
I know, right? If only it were that simple. So I really quickly, before the break, I kind of went through the methods of the study, kind of like the general outline, the study design. Why don't you walk us through what you looked at and how you designed this study to study these 2 kilning temperatures, the effective kilning temperature on hops?
So in the first harvest year that we did this and proposed this, we were working really closely with the Hop Research Council brewers and a number of hop growers. It's really a culmination of an industry effort in curiosity and willingness to be engaged and interested in what was going on to offer up these resources. So, I mean, I have to kind of say that up front, because without all those growers and brewers that participated in this research would have not been possible. So when we kind of went into this, we had a couple growers that we had worked with in the 2 previous harvest years in that 120, 140, 160 study we briefly talked about. And so we went back to a lot of those same growers and then added multiple other growers as we were looking for these different varieties grown at different farms. I didn't really want to put too much stress on one grower to be helping us out with this research. So what we did is we picked our hop varieties. We found a grower for each of those hop varieties to dry, that was willing to dry them for us. And we chose, Yakima is kind of hop capital of the United States hop growing region. I think over 75% of U.S. hops are grown in Washington.
Something like that.
Valley.
Yeah, it's huge. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it makes sense you would go there. And Oregon was really nice because I was based out of Corvallis, so there was a couple of growers in the Willamette Valley that we also worked with, which is also a sizable growing region. I mean, I think 10 or 11% or so of the overall hop pie in the Pacific Northwest. So we chose those two states, and we had these two temperature treatments, which we kind of talked about, Y130 and Y150 already. So I won't bore you with the details again, but those are kind of our boundaries. And one of the goals of this study was to look at these more narrow, like realistic temperature boundaries, but also look at a multitude of aroma varieties and see, is there a variety dependence? Like, are some varieties sensitive to temperature and others not, or are they all relatively temperature insensitive? Because previously we had looked at just Simcoe and Amarillo. So we did that, and we also wanted to create this collaborative effort where we would be in 2020 sending out samples from the study blind coded to brewers to have them look at their sensory panels, because there was a big kind of like question in the industry. It's like, is this something like, I don't know, lower temperatures seem better? There was still like a lot of skepticism at this point. And we kind of wanted to give these samples to brewers so that they could evaluate them blind coded on hand without any kind of indication of what was high temperature and what was low temperature, and really get like raw, like real data from them and get their perspective. So that was kind of part of the 2020 design. And so after hops went through their drying treatment at these different farms, we had them pelletized by Yakima Chief. So the samples that were pelletized or done in the Yakima area were pelletized by Yakima Chief hops in Yakima. And the ones from Oregon were dried on pilot scale, or pelletized on pilot scale at Oregon State University, because we had our own little pelletizer. So that was really nice and convenient to not have to store a bunch of whole cone hops. This was the first year that we had the pelletizer. So all the previous years I was storing a bunch of whole cone hops, which was not very space efficient.
Ooh, yeah. Yeah, definitely not. Yeah, the pelletizer made that, yeah, nice. And I think we have the same pelletizer even in Yakima, right? They were also using theirs on their pilot scale pelletizer.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Nice. So it's kind of like you're kind of, the study design is just trying to take out sources of variation, right? Like you're going across two states so that there's not any, I don't know, criticism that Yakima hops are different than Oregon hops or whatever, or would have dried differently in those two places. You pelletize them on the same equipment. You dry them. I mean, they dried in two different locations, right? One in Yakima, one in Oregon, but still drying at commercial scales under the same conditions, right? Creating as close to the same kilning conditions that you can have there. And then doing a whole bunch of different varieties. So taking out that varietal source of variation and doing it over 2 years. So taking out the harvest year variation. So the whole study design is just kind of like remove all these different sources of variation so you can actually see if kilning at 130 or 150 has an impact.
Exactly. That was the goal, is to try to see, because there are a lot of factors that can influence hop quality and hop drying. And, you have to consider bed depth. You have to consider airflow. Like, these are all other components to hop drying, because hop drying isn't just temperature. And we really tried to limit as many variables that could influence the results of this study. That's why it kind of expanded and blew up to the size that it was.
Yeah. And then, of course, you looked at a whole bunch of different analytes as well, right? I mean, the chemistry analyses are looking at bitter acids, looking at total oil breakdown. So that's, something like 25 or 26, maybe 24 different hop aromatic compounds that are present in hop oil. And then even did a little bit of thiol chemistry, I think, for 1 year, right? 2020 had thiol chemistry.
Yes. In 2020, we had a little bit of thiol chemistry done as well.
Yeah. So you're looking at all these different chemical analytes, and that's kind of like basic hop quality stuff, right? Bitter acids and HSI and aroma and oil breakdown. But then sensory analysis too. And the cool thing here too is you did two types of sensory analysis. You did hop grinds, so smelling the actual ground hops, and then you also brewed beers to see if there were any differences in the beer. So again, trying to take out this variation. It's not like we just smelled these hops and we're making the story great off of that. We smelled them and then also brewed beers with them. And then, of course, the final thing was the hop creep enzyme analysis, the dextrin-reducing enzyme analysis. So this look like a really holistic look at the hops. Are there any changes based on kilning? And again, I want to point back to this because I think it's a really real strength of the study is like the power of this. You've got two different states, 2 different years, 2 different, 6 different varieties, as everything you can do to try to make a cohesive, uniform, powerful study that people can look at and make decisions about what they do in terms of drying their hops. So it's pretty cool. All right, results time. So first thing we have to talk about is hop drying time, right? Because if you're not reducing the hop drying time, then the growers don't have an incentive to kiln at higher temperatures, right? I mean, unless maybe there's an energy cost or something. But how did kilning at higher temperatures affect dry time?
I mean, it ranged anywhere, kind of like I mentioned earlier, anywhere from 20 to a little over 40% reductions in drying time with respect to the variety. Each variety is different. But I mean, that's a lot of time savings there. Like, we give like the significant reduction, which can really help out the grower you're in a really slammed during harvest and you really want to get your varieties out of the field that need to be coming out of the field.
Yeah. I mean, and like, again, the big point, you said that earlier too, like 20% of even 7 hours, that's hours of drying time. Think of a variety like Centennial that's 12 or 14. If you got back a couple hours or 3 hours of your time, holy moly. I mean, that's huge. And for every variety, for every batch that's going through there, you're getting hours back. That can be a big time savings for the growers.
And the other thing here too, that like kind of, as we were going through this study is when you're thinking about these reduction in drying time, sometimes even just knocking 30 minutes off their drying time can make a huge difference. We got that comment from growers a lot. It's like, hey, if you could save me 30 minutes on Mosaic, that would be awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's like, there's something there to that. That's like, this can actually make a meaningful impact in drying time and efficiency of, your operation.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're like 30 minutes. I got you. I got a couple hours. How about that?
Right. Well, and with, like growers, if they're going to be making any kind of functional change to their drying temperatures, it would be like, okay, instead of drying at 130, we'll dry out 135. They're not going to be making a 20-degree jump more than likely, which we could kind of get into in like how hops are dried and how they determine when hops are ready.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we actually didn't do that. Let's stop real quick and talk about it. How do they know? How do you know when hops are done? It's not like I always say it's not like they go ding.
It's a moving target because it's like you're trying to make sure that your bottom of your bed isn't totally over dried, that it's just absolutely shattered, that your middle of the bed is like prime time and your top of the bed is a little under. But they have these people that have been coming and working at these hop farms for a couple decades that come and actually touch the hops. There's like these hop whisperers, I think is what Tom calls them, that come in like really can feel the hop and tell when they're ready to go. And then they use that in conjunction with like moisture readings throughout the hop bed.
Yeah.
So, but if you're drying at a higher temperature, moisture is moving off those beds a lot faster. So it makes finding that perfect target where you're getting that 9% moisture content a lot more challenging. So it's like a timing shift for growers, right? So it's like, okay, like we've been drying at 135 for 5 years, and we know that Citra takes 7.5 hours at 130. So I'm going to start checking moisture for it at about 6.5 hours. But if you bump the temperature up, that changes like your whole system and like how you've been running and drying these varieties. So you have to think about like how that might impact. So growers are probably more likely to make like a 5-degree change than a 20-degree change.
Sure. Yeah, it makes sense, right? Make an incremental change. I mean, we don't have to make a radical change. Like, even an incremental change would save them time. And that's interesting. And so that's another key finding here from your study too, because you mentioned like the whole goal is to hit this like target, 8 to 12% moisture. Did the hop temperature, did the kilning temperature affect where the hops landed, right? Did it make it like harder for the growers to hit the moisture content?
No, we were in our targets every time. And it's but it was in case like they knew that these were special trials. We knew they were being closely monitored. I'm monitoring them with a moisture balance also.
Yeah.
So that we could get an idea of like, how long is this going to take? Because this is new for everybody. So we're kind of keeping a close eye on it to make sure that we're hitting our targets. Because I mean, it becomes over dried or under dried, then these hops aren't, a great candidate for the study. And then we lose a whole harvest year of data on Citra if it's not dried appropriately.
Yeah. Geez, and then the growers lose a whole kiln of hops, which is
exactly.
That's a lot of money. Okay, all right. So hop drying time definitely reduced with higher kiln temperatures. Again, that was as expected, and it's just sort of interestingly aside. I thought this was funny. The p-value on that, when you look at the statistical significance of whether temperature had an impact on drying time, the p-value was less than 0.001, which is as low as the statistical software goes. So yeah, it was significant. Okay,
across the board.
Yeah, right, across the board. But something that was less significant was the chemistry variables. And before we get into the chemistry, we got to talk about this concept that you use in the paper called fold change, because that's the way that you use to understand the chemical variables. So let's talk about what is fold change and how do we use that fold change to understand these results.
So fold change is essentially looking at what the concentration of the analyte was dried at 150 relative to 130. So if there's no change between the chemistry, let's say total oil, for example, let's say we have total oil of Simcoe at 1.5 mils, and then we have for 130, and then we have like 1.6 for 150. You essentially take that 1.6 from the 150 and divide it by the 1.5 for the 130, and then you get your fold change. So the closer it is to 1, that means that there's no difference. So that could be like 0.8 to or 0.85 or 0.9 to 1.1. That would be pretty close to no change there. So if it is greater than 1, that means that there was an increase in analyte concentration drying at 150 relative to 130. And the other way is if less than 1, so say it's 0.9, then it is a decrease in analyte concentration drying at 150 relative to 130. So we use that to determine kind of holistically, like, okay, how are these different analytes being impacted by temperature? And how can we look at this broad scale with like, okay, are we seeing a lot of changes like with one variety, or are we not seeing very many changes with respect to drying temperature?
And so, especially in this scenario, then with drying at a higher temperature, you would expect to see, since 150 is kind of like the numerator and the 130 is the denominator, you would expect to see the analytes go down if volatile aroma was blowing off, right? Right. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And one of the barriers we kind of used in this study was like 0.8, a full change of 0.85, which would represent a 15% reduction in analyte concentration, and 1.15, which would represent a 15% increase in analyte concentration with drying at 150 relative to 130, as like these bounds that if there was analytes fell outside of that range, that they were significantly impacted by drying temperature, because there are variability in hops. Like they're going to be inherently variable field to field, within a field, year to year, and that plus or minus 0.15 is kind of trying to capture that variability. So we're not being like, oh, we're calling it different or calling that this was impacted by drying temperature, when really it's this variability in the hops.
Right. Field to field, maturity, sampling, right? The actual analyses that happen have some variation.
Exactly.
So that 15% window is kind of like, if it falls outside of 15%, then we saw some variation based on the temperature.
Right. So if like you saw 30% decrease or a full change of 0.7, then you would be like, okay, there was an impact with temperature.
Yeah. Okay, so did we see any fold changes in the chemistry data?
Generally, no. Generally, we saw more variation between harvest years. Like, for example, in Simcoe in 2020, we saw some decrease in analyte concentration with respect to drying temperature. But then we didn't see that same effect the next year. And mind you, with this like case of Simcoe, we went to one farm in 2020 and then we went to the same farm in 2021 so that we were using the same system so that we could compare these Simcoes from 2020 and 2021. And we did that across the board with the exception of Centennial, which Centennial is another interesting one where we saw some differences in our 2020 trials where we saw significant reductions in analyte concentration with respect to temperature. But that field was torn out after that year of harvest. They replaced it with a different variety. So we couldn't go back to that same farm in 2021. So instead, we went to two different farms in 2021 and looked at Centennial and other places because we saw these reductions. So we wanted to see like, okay, is this consistent for Centennial? Because we did see these decreases where we didn't really see the decreases in Amarillo, Cascade, Mosaic, and Citra. They seemed fairly temperature insensitive with respect to these chemistry analytes that we looked at. And in the case of Centennial, we had one farm in 2021 where there was a decrease in analyte concentration, but at the other farm, there wasn't. So we're getting this farm to farm variability. We're getting year to year variability that kind of makes it hard to say that like, yes, it's temperature because there's a lot of other factors that go into hop processing on the farm that could have way greater impacts on hop quality or hop chemistry even than just drying. It's a really multifaceted issue.
Yeah, and that's where I was thinking. That's the key, right? Is there? It seems like these other things, based on your results in this data, that these other things might have more of an impact than the temperature that you're kilning at, right? The harvest year variation might be wider, might swing wider than the difference between kilning at 130 versus 150, or the farm to farm variation. Simcoe's on one farm may be different than Simcoe's on farm B, right? Or a different farm. That variation seems like it's much wider. There's much more variation by those things. And so when you take all that variation and you kind of strip it away, you really don't see any significant chemistry changes. At least, I mean, you can look at some specific analytes in some specific harvest years or some farms, but there's really not any broad trend that you're able to derive. It's not like it's as easy as, yeah, we saw fold change decreases in all aromatic, compounds. You didn't see anything like that. There were no clear trends from the chemistry variables.
And the crazy thing is, like, in some cases, like in the case of Cascade in 2021, we saw increase in a lot of analytes, which was drying at the higher temperature. So it's like so variable, right? Yeah. So it's like, you're like, okay, we're seeing increases now in concentration at 150 instead of drying at 130. I mean, generally we see not a change. Like Mosaic seems really temperature insensitive. From 2020 and 2021, they really just kind of sit really close to that one line.
Interesting. Yeah, and so even like the variety differences might be specific to these, but again, it doesn't seem to be related, at least in terms of the chemistry variables, to the temperature change. It's other sources of variation that seem to explain the data a little bit better.
Well, that's why it's like in looking at this, it was so important to us that we went back to the same farm both years for each of the varieties. So for the case of Amarillo, Cascade, Citra, Mosaic, and Simcoe, we went back to the same farm in 2020 and 2021. So that we could we're not like dealing with a farm effect here also. We're just seeing like a harvest year impact and a temperature impact.
Yeah. Makes sense, right? You eliminate that variability, especially whenever you're seeing this. And so then another question that people would have too, and you mentioned it earlier, is, okay, we can look at the chemistry and see, we're not really seeing a clear picture from the chemistry, but ultimately, what does it smell like? Or what does it taste like? So sensory was a big piece of this as well. So why don't you talk to us real quick about the sensory that you did and maybe some of those results?
Yeah. So the sensory was one of those things that was like the very challenging component to this, because we had these hop grinds. We did sensory evaluations on the hop grinds, and what you see in the hop grinds as far as like differences or lack thereof doesn't necessarily translate to beer. Where what we found is like in hop grinds where we saw maybe differences between 130 and 150 in the hops, we didn't necessarily see in the beers made with those hops in the 130, 150 comparison. So the differences become more subtle and dampened by the brewing process. So then you're seeing like, okay, functionally, when you move these through brewing, you're not really seeing an impact from the aromatic perspective. But what was most interesting about this is when we had cases where differences were seen and statistically significant from our panel, then we asked them to describe those differences in descriptive analysis, and we were just getting really messy data. And so we're getting like, okay, the panelists can identify when a difference exists, but then can't describe what that difference is. In using like check all that apply, attribute scaling, projective mapping, you name these different descriptive analysis methods. I tried it to try to really figure out like, what is this? What is driving these differences then? And are these differences that actually matter to the characteristic of this hop? So what we did moving forward after we kept kind of getting this messy data, and we're trying to kind of pinpoint like, okay, well, at least can we determine if these important aromatic characteristics of these hop varieties where differences are being found being affected? So in the case of 2020 Centennial, there was differences found in the beers. So between the 130 and the 150. So we went ahead and did a forced attribute testing where we asked panelists to choose like which of these two beers is higher in citrus character, which is higher in resinous character, and which is higher in overall hop aroma intensity. So citrus and resinous being really important characteristics to the aroma of Centennial, we're trying to see were at least those impacted or are they not? And in this case, we found in 2020 that the 130 was found to be significantly more resinous in aromatic quality than the 150. But then you move into 2021 and panelists didn't even think the 130 and 150 were different from one another.
Interesting.
So, we're like, okay, maybe that kind of leads into why we looked at two different farms in 2021, because Centennial was the only case where we were able to find an attribute that panelists said that were different between the two treatments. Like we looked at Cascade, Mosaic, Simcoe, Amarillo, and Citra, and anytime a difference was found, panelists couldn't say that a main vein, like important aromatic characteristic to that hop was impacted. So like for the case of Cascade, we looked at citrus and herbal were characteristics we asked them to identify. And even if they found differences, they couldn't identify. Those characteristics were not impacted by temperature. So there's something else there. So they could say it's different. They can't tell us why. And, the cases where we found differences in 2020, we didn't find differences in 2021, which gets really frustrating when you're looking at sensory data and looking at the statistics as a scientist. You're like, what is going on here? Why can't we figure this out? But, what it really comes down to is that maybe these differences don't matter.
Oh, yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Like wow. Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about that. Like as I was sitting there, if I was doing that sensory research and I got to experience some of this with you and some of your frustration going like, Cade, look at these data. What is going on here? I think you just summed it up incredibly well. And there was a good line in your paper that said the impact of kilning temperature may result in detectable differences in some samples, but there's not enough of an impact for it to be describable. And to your point, maybe it's not even, it's just, it's different, but not different enough that we can put our finger on it or we can say what it is or anything. And then again, the differences weren't consistent. That's another key piece of this, right? It's not like Centennial saw differences every year or Simcoe did. They were like sporadic differences, right? That was, 1 year Amarillo might be significant between the two beers and the next year not, or, it might be, and then other varieties, the same thing. So there seems to be, maybe that's the comment again, or I'll ask you this question, right? We've talked about with the chemistry data, there seemed to be other variation that maybe explains the differences. Do you think it's the same for sensory?
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many on-farm parameters that could be influencing our aromatic quality. Like every grower has, we have some metrics that we generally use to determine maturity, but every grower does it a little bit different. So you have maturity playing a role in there. We have potential of terroir playing a role in there. You can have climate playing a role in there. 2020 was a really smoky harvest in Oregon. And, that could be influencing quality. There's so many different factors here from a climate perspective, location, grower, like specific farm management perspective that could be having a much larger impact on quality that we don't even realize.
Yeah, and again, like this is one of the things I mentioned earlier too, right? Is the power of this study, looking at the different states, different years, different varieties, but also in the sensory evaluations, you looked at hop grinds and at beers, right? So you even mentioned too that there might have been significant differences in a triangle or a tetrad of hop grinds that didn't carry over to the beer, or vice versa. There might have been significant differences in the beer that weren't in the hop grinds.
Right. And then the other component to this, which is like interesting, is in 2020, we sent these samples out to, like I kind of mentioned earlier, 2 different brewers. We had, I want to say 6 or 7 different industry panels also evaluate these samples from hops. And they also, in some cases, brewed their own single hop IPAs and did sensory evaluations on them. And generally, we didn't see differences in those panels. Like, they did not find differences between 130 and 150, where in some cases with our panel at Oregon State, we did find differences. But when you culminate all of this data, you really don't see that big of differences from an aromatic perspective. When you have other people from industry participating, we had people from Bell's, Boston Beer, New Belgium, RAR, Malting, and Yakima Chief Hops, and John I. Haas all look at these samples.
Yeah, just some small companies in the brewing industry.
Because that was the other thing, is like, we didn't want it to be like we're the only people looking at it. We have this narrative and we have this data. We wanted it to be very outward facing with the industry, because it's like, the grower is going to do what the brewer wants.
Yeah. Sure.
Right. I mean, they're growing hops for the brewing industry. And if the brewing industry feels that lower temperature is important to them, then that's what the grower is going to do, even if it's less efficient for them to dry at a lower temperature. It takes more time. It creates bottlenecks. But by kind of interfacing and putting this outward in the industry, it kind of helped create this conversation in the industry outside of just, a few papers.
Yeah, exactly. And it seems like too that even though there were some significant differences in some samples, like you mentioned, there weren't enough significant differences. There wasn't enough trend across all of the sources of variation across the harvest year and state and variety and all this stuff. There weren't enough significant differences there that you could point to the kilning temperature being responsible for those differences, right?
We couldn't say like, every year in every farm we looked at for Centennial was impacted by drying temperature. We can't say that because that's not true.
Right.
And we can't say that for any of these varieties. So we can't pinpoint and say like, okay, maybe this variety is temperature sensitive or these varieties are temperature insensitive.
Yeah. Except
because there's so...
Oh, sorry.
There's
go
so
ahead.
much variability. There's so much variability of just like of what could be going on and how these samples are handled.
Right. Except in hop creep, in the dextrin reducing enzyme activity.
Yes.
That was the one that you did see a significant and consistent trend as kilning temperature, hop creep decreased.
Yes. Across the board, every time, without fail. But one of the interesting anecdotes that kind of came out of that is we also kind of had an opportunity to kind of look at these different hop varieties and look at their how creepy each of these hops could be and what their hop creep potential might be. Because we consistently see varieties like Citra sitting much lower in hop enzymatic activity than compared to a variety like Cascade. And that's just another thing we gleaned out of this, like, temperature, looking at temperatures. We saw that, we see decreases in temperature with respect to, or decreases in hop dextrin reducing enzymes with respect to temperature. But like, hey, we're also kind of seeing that Cascade is consistently sitting much higher in enzymatic activity than the others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's one of those graphics. I mean, if this was the Brewlosophy show, if this was the YouTube channel, you would be looking right now at a graphic that Lindsey put together, which is a beautiful graphic. It's got all 6 of the varieties on there, and then it's got our hop creep assay, which measures the amount of glucose and maltose that's released when you add hops to beer. And you can clearly see there are varietal differences between the 6 varieties. And so it's a great graphic. I'm sure it'll make its way around the internet. eventually for hop creep. But it shows clearly, like, even though, yes, in Amarillo, the 150 Fahrenheit had lower hop creep, right? So higher temperature, lower hop creep. The Amarillo was still totally different than the Cascade. Cascade might be the highest, and what was it, like Citra or something that was the lowest? I'm not exactly sure which one's the lowest.
Yeah, Citra was the lowest.
Yeah, but it's this beautiful graph. And so again, you see here that, like, okay, kilning temperature does have an impact in hop creep, but it's still way less than the differences between the varieties, right? That the variety would play a much larger role in enzyme activity than kilning temperature, even though this is really like the only thing that you could see a consistent trend, that there was a decrease, or, at higher temperatures. So I think that's also something that's sort of powerful and sort of supports this idea that hop kilning temperature doesn't seem to be impacting the hops in a meaningful way, except in dextrin reducing enzyme activity.
It certainly doesn't seem to be hurting quality.
Right, sure. Yeah, that's a better way to say it. I like that. Much better way to say it. It doesn't seem to be hurting quality at the higher temperature. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right, so I have to ask this question then before we leave. Well, I have two more questions for you. But one of the questions is, okay, so there were all of these analyses, having done these analyses, I know, like the chemistry, the sensory, the beer brewing and stuff, you only need like a few kilos of hops. So what happened to all of the other hops that were part of this kilning study?
So generally when short story, they go out into the wild, they're used, they're selected, they go to brewers just like any other lot. But what really happens is, like, you have like 10 different kilns, say, at a grower, and they're all picking, they're pulling mosaic from all of those, right? In all of those kilns. So that mosaic trial gets dumped into a greater pile of mosaic hops. So it's like kind of blended down. But they don't just say, like, okay, well, those hops are dead to us now.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they were dried at 150. I mean, that's expensive. That's a lot of hops. So it does kind of go out into greater circulation, just mixed in with what their normal protocol would be.
Exactly. And that's kind of a testament too, that like the growers and distributors weren't so much like, oh my God, these hops are like, we can't use these anymore. Right. Like we can't put these out into circulation. I mean, these are done. Like we have to hold these, it's kind of a testament as well. All right. Well, then I told you I had two questions. So what happened with the hops? That's question number one. And question number two is the question I ask all my guests at the end of the show. It's, if you want brewers to take away just one thing from today's episode, what would it be?
Oh my goodness, that's a tough one.
Oh, come on. I sent it to you in advance.
What I want them to take away. Gosh. I feel like that, we put so much time and energy thinking about like how maybe this one process might be influencing quality. And we really have to think about it from a greater brewing perspective. It's that, like, sometimes the stuff that you think matter don't. And sometimes the things that you don't think matter could be having a much larger impact than you think. Because really where we landed is that we put so much time and energy into really driving the industry into drying at lower temperatures to put some data on it to find that, like, oh, this actually doesn't seem to have an impact. And if anything, we saw an increase in cases of hop creep in the late 2000s and the mid 2000s as drying temperatures started to shift to lower temperatures. I mean, that could just be a coincidence that it just started, maybe because we were also heavily dry hopping beers at that point. But it's kind of interesting to see that. So I think these are multifaceted issues.
Yeah, well, I think you're certainly preaching to the choir here for on the Brewlosophy podcast. Some things matter that you think may not matter, and then some things don't matter that you think are like the most important thing in the world. But you never know until you try it, until you put it to the test, until you do some science.
Right. I mean, this study, we really thought that we were just going to be putting numbers on what a conventional wisdom was in the industry. The conventional wisdom was low and slow, was going to be better for aroma hops. And we're like, okay, great. We're saying that. Let's put some numbers on it. And we got a lot more than we bargained for.
Yeah, got a lot more than you bargained for. And it'll be interesting to see where the industry goes with this information in the future. You know, I mean, are we going to start seeing kilns at higher temperatures? I mean, we won't, right? As brewers, we're just going to get the hops that are sent to us, but maybe some relief pressure from on the hop growers. And if you're able to have those conversations with your hop grower, maybe that's something that the industry will start to talk about. But in any event, all right, I think we covered, hop kilning and kilning at 130 or 150, but is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to today?
I think that there's one other component, and it's kind of the sustainability component to this, because there was a life cycle analysis done on hop dry, or just hops as a whole, like in the Pacific Northwest, done by Dean Hauser. I think he published that in 2019. That showed that the hop drying process can account for nearly 40% of the carbon footprint and carbon emissions that go into the growing and processing of hops. So this is such a big energy component to it. And when we're thinking about drying temperature, if you're drying at these lower temperatures for a really long time, your fans on, you're burning fuel, you're kind of sedimenting this like large carbon footprint. Where there could potentially be energy savings, which kind of got into the back end of my work. We do have a paper that will be coming out about that at some point this year or early next year that showcase like what these higher temperatures do to the energy footprint. So a little plug for work to come.
Yeah, sustainability impact of this too. I mean, we didn't focus on that show, but that's a huge deal. If you can actually reduce the amount of fossil fuel consumption or any of those things, cut down on drying time, all of those things, save energy consumption for the growers. Those are money, right? That's cost.
Right.
For
that's
the
cost,
growers.
that's money. And as the brewing industry as it is, it's like I feel like we tend to be pretty sustainable and sustainability minded. So it's something that can really kind of get people thinking and talking about where higher temperature hop drying might play a role in the future.
Well, awesome. And that sounds like a perfect show idea for a future episode. So I would love to have you back to talk about that once that research is released. And Lindsey, of course, thank you so much for joining me on the Brew Lab.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great chatting about hop drying.
All right. Well, hey, listeners, in the show notes, you'll find a link to the article, which was published in the Journal of the American Society of Brewing Chemists in April of 2023. Next week, Jordan and I will be back applying the science of this episode. See y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brewlosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brewlosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.